Thank you all for joining us this morning on one of many listening sessions we are doing on the Economic Recovery Act of 2020, this one on Historic Property Reinvestment Program. Governor Murphy signed the New Jersey Economic Recovery Act into law on January 7th, 21. The ERA creates a package of tax incentive, financing, and grant programs to build a stronger, fairer New Jersey economy. It's a broad-based recovery bill and reform bill that will better position New Jersey to recover from economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic while remaining true to the NJEDA's commitments to transparency and accountability. If you want to learn more about the Economic Recovery Act in general, you can see that on our website, njeda.com/Economic Recovery Act. So specifically today, we're doing a listening session. In our commitment to transparency, equity, and faithful stewardship of taxpayer dollars, we are looking today for constructive input from all New Jerseyans interested as we work through the process of implementing the programs under the ERA. There will be multiple opportunities for public. Today's session is one way that we're collecting informal program-specific feedback, and we'll do that. And I believe the next slide, Caitlin, will let you know when we're going to do that. We're going to do that at the end of the presentation. What we're looking for is constructive input on how to ensure our new programs created through the ERA are structured and administered in a manner that drives opportunities for all residents and communities. The session will begin with a presentation on the draft rules, and the opportunity for feedback will follow that, and expected to have around 75 to 90 minutes reserved specifically for that public input. Next slide. We also have an opportunity for you to submit written feedback. For the Historic Property Reinvestment Program, that link is njeda.com/program-specific-feedback, and that's open through December 23rd. Okay, when we get to the end, and I'm going to repeat this, you might get a little tired of hearing it. What you're going to want to do in order to provide feedback is raise your hand using that function in Zoom. You can put it in writing through a Q&A feature, but we do appreciate more the raising hand and any written feedback submitted through the link, and we will post that link again at the end of the session. Each member of the public who wishes to speak, once you raise your hand, you'll be put into a queue in the order in which you raise your hand. We will give everyone a maximum of 3 minutes to speak, and please limit your input to matters pertaining to the Economic Recovery Act of 2020, the Historic Property Reinvestment Program, or the draft rules. You'll have one opportunity to provide remarks unless we have a significant amount of time remaining at the end, and you do want to provide more, you can raise your hand again. If we have time, we will get to you. The expectation for our presenters is not to engage in any sort of project-specific dialogue. We are here, though, to answer basic questions and clarify anything about the program that you didn't feel you quite understood throughout the presentation. We do ask that everybody remember their manners when this is being recorded, and it is a public session, so provide your comments, maintain proper decorum, and be civil. That has not been a problem for any of our sessions to date, and I don't think it will be today. So the NJEDA staff is going to summarize the draft rules and provide context. Again, the link to where you can provide written program-specific feedback is up on the screen now. Text highlighted in green indicates areas where the EDA has used rules to add clarity to the legislation. Non-highlighted text is written into law, which the NJEDA does not have any discretion to change. At this point, I'm going to turn the conversation over to NJEDA CEO Tim Sullivan, who's here with us this morning. Thanks for joining us, Tim.
Thanks, Patience. Thanks for everyone, first and foremost, for taking the time to be on this call. I know you all got plenty going on. It's holiday season. It's the end of the year. People are wrapping things up, and you're taking the time to be on the call with us, or on the Zoom, whatever this is, for this program. On behalf of Governor Murphy, we're really excited about this program in particular. The entire Economic Recovery Act is such a game changer for the New Jersey economy, but this program in particular is one I'm particularly excited about. It's one of the programs in the ERA that is brand new. So Emerge is sort of a successor to Grow, Aspire is a successor to ERG. This historic property program, historic preservation program, is brand new. Prior to Governor Murphy signing that bill last January, New Jersey was only one of 11 states that didn't have a state level historic property, historic tax credit. I have no idea why. But now we're off that list. Now we're on the good list, not the bad list. Now we have this program, which is really exciting. If you go, city by city and into our suburban and rural communities as well, New Jersey's got great historic bones. NJEDA's sitting in front of a backdrop of one of our great historic buildings. I think that's Asbury Park. Just one great example. But if you're in Patterson or Camden, I was in Camden yesterday, there's historic buildings all over the place. In Patterson and Trenton, our capital city where I'm sitting this morning, we have such great opportunities to revitalize our communities, bring new jobs, new housing, new investment, new economic activity, particularly to our cities, but really all throughout the state via investing the time, money, and love that is needed to bring historic properties back to productive use. So we're really excited about this program. This process has proven itself enormously helpful in other programs. The rules that are out there, the proposal that we're talking about this morning only gets better from here via this feedback and this input process. And so we're deeply appreciative of in advance of the comments and the sort of suggestions we'll get from here. The other thing I just want to do before handing it back and shutting up and letting us get to the meat of what we're talking about here, I just want to give a shout out to our partners in government who have been great allies and partners in getting us here, particularly DEP at SHPO, Commissioner LaTourette, and on down at the team there, our great Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver over at DCA and the team that works on historic preservation for her, and the Department of State and Secretary of State Tahisha Way and her team that is deeply involved in historic preservation and supporting preservation activities all throughout the state. So this has been a great team effort. I'm positive we haven't gotten it perfect. It's the nature of the exercise, and this is an opportunity for us to learn, listen, hear what looks good, bad, and in between. And I definitely follow patience's decorum rules, or you'll get in trouble with patience, which is bad. You don't want to be in trouble with patience on the civility rules. I kid because patience is one of my great colleagues. With that, eager to get into it, describe the program a little bit, and hear from all of you who have taken the time to be on this call, how we can make this better, good, bad, and in between feedback. So with that, thanks for letting me be on.
Alrighty. Good morning, everybody. My name is Aidita Melstead. I'm the Director of Historic Preservation at the EDA, and I'm going to walk you through basically the basics of the program. It was stated before, we'll have some areas that are highlighted green. Those are areas that where items have been clarified as part of the rules. What is a Historic Property Reinvestment Program? It was established as part of the Economic Recovery Act of 2020. And it's set up in a way that to work in conjunction with the Federal Historic Tax Credit Program. And what it meant to do is provide tax credits to incentivize historic rehabilitation in New Jersey. The program is going to be run as a competitive program, so we'll have applications that will be due by a pre-established deadline, and awards will be based on competitive scoring. And it focuses on historic preservation as a component of community development. We're looking for this program to bolster smart growth investment focused on the rehabilitation of existing identified historic structures, and ultimately helping in many cases to bring often underutilized properties back to productive use. The program is looked to encourage long-term private investment in the state while preserving properties that are of historic importance. And like all programs in the ERA, it includes a number of fiscal protections. So the key features of the program is capped at $300 million for 6 years, or would that translate to $50 million per year of the program. And it's set up in a way that if there's any of those $50 million that are not used in any given year, it would roll over to the following year. And it also has some options for some specific types of projects to be able to borrow from a subsequent year in case we had reached the $50 million cap. The awards range from 40 to 45% of the rehabilitation costs, and rehabilitation costs basically equal eligible costs. And it's 40% of the rehabilitation costs for a qualified property up to a maximum of $4 million. If you have a project with a qualified property that is in a government restricted municipality or a qualified incentive track, then it's 45% up to a maximum of $8 million. And then we have some projects that that deal with transformative properties, and those can have a credit of 45% up to a maximum of $50 million. As mentioned before, the tax credit will be awarded via competitive application process. So we'll set up the application deadlines, and all applications will come in at one time, and we will review and score it. The project business entity, which is basically the applicant, must also pay prevailing wage for all construction work. In addition to that, it must pay prevailing wage for building services for 10 years following project completion. So this is kind of a general program project timeline that will walk you through what the process of the project would go through. So first, as we said, the business entity would submit an application by a pre-established deadline. Then applications will all be reviewed and scored, and this will include at the same time, there's going to be concurrent reviews. One will be for the criteria that will be scored, and then at the same time, we'll be conducting sort of financial and legal reviews. After that review is completed, the top ranked projects will be presented to the board of EDA's board for approval. Then once projects are approved, at this time, projects, if anybody has an issue and would like to submit an appeal, this is the time to do it. The one time where you can submit an appeal if you disagree with your scoring or any issue or deficiency on your application that was identified. At that time, so when we review the applications, the expectation is that we're going to be reviewing, among other things, what your project approach is. The project approach should include how you plan to comply with the Secretary of the Interior standards, which the statute requires substantial compliance with the standards. And we will review and score based on that. However, there's going to be a subsequent review. Once the approvals are completed by the board, that is when our staff, together with the Historic Preservation Office, will be completing a full review of Secretary of the Interior standards to make sure that everything is done. One of the reasons why this is in this location, this review portion, is that it allows us to, once there's awards, it allows us some back and forth to be able to have the best way to review and address any potential concerns that we have, or anything that could be that maybe there's a change that is required, minor modification to what the requirements are. Another requirement, what was submitted, and maybe some tweaks, similar to what happens when you submit for a federal tax credit program. Once this is completed, as well as the applicant completes any condition that they had on their approval, often includes submitting financial documentation, finalist financial documentation, maybe proof of site control, then a rehabilitation agreement will be finalized and signed. It is at this point, when the rehabilitation agreement happens, that the clock for the timelines that are allowed under the program for construction will start. Then the project will go through the construction phase. After construction, then that's when submissions for certification will be submitted, and information will be provided to show that the project has been completed, that you spend the money you said you were going to spend, that you're in compliance with all the requirements of the agreement. And at that time, then you can get your issuance of the tax credit. Subsequent to this point, which is what we're calling quote unquote project completion, there's two additional requirements that go beyond that. So first, there's requirements for annual reporting to go for 5 years past the project completion. There's also some requirements with regards to prohibiting changes to the property in such a manner that would affect the rehabilitation agreement, that would impede or make changes that will no longer then meet with the Secretary of the Interior standards. And then 5 years post that is when you have a 10-year from the end of the construction or the project completion, that you have your compliance requirement with regards to prevailing wage for building services. Next slide. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about kind of break down the program into 6 sections. So we are going to talk first about eligibility, then we're going to talk in a little bit more about what's a rehabilitation project, what is that defined under the rules and the statute. We'll talk about the award size, review, how the applications will be reviewed, and then some additional program information, and lastly, program fees. Next. So the eligibility criteria, these are the main items for eligibility criteria. So I'm not going to linger on this and just move to talk about them individually. So next slide. First, economic feasibility. So one of the requirements is that the business entity must demonstrate at the time of application that without the tax credit, the rehabilitation project is not economically feasible. Then on top of that, oops, previous slide. Okay, so then we also, you need to show that there is a project financing gap that exists, and that the tax credit being considered for the project is equal or less of the project financing gap. So you can't say that, for example, that you have a $1 million financing gap, but you're seeking $3 million in tax credits. Next. The commencement of the construction, the statute also calls for the business entity to not have commenced any construction or rehabilitation activity at the site prior to submitting an application. And further, it also states that the business entity will not commence any construction activity until the execution of the rehabilitation agreement. So basically, there could be no construction until the rehabilitation agreement is signed and finalized. So no work on the project until that point. There's also requirements with regards to project and equity, which is basically, this is capital contributed by the business entity. And for projects, regular projects, there is a requirement for contributing equity of at least 20% of the total cost of the rehabilitation. A clarification here is that total cost of rehabilitation means the entire project cost. So these terms are can be similar, but cost of rehabilitation means eligible cost. Total cost of rehabilitation means total project cost. There is one exception, and that exception is based basically on location. So if you have a project that is in a government restricted municipality, then the requirement for equity is only 10% of the total cost of rehabilitation. Next. The overall cost of rehabilitation also, this is what the minimum size basically of the project. And again, this comes straight from the statute, and it's a requirement that it could not be less than the greater of either the adjusted basis of the cost of the structure in the qualified property or transformative property, as used for federal income tax purposes, or $5,000. And this is matches, I believe, word for word what's in the federal program. Additionally, there's some residential project requirements. The program is meant to work for income producing properties. So when it comes to residential, it has to be a property that is for residential rental purpose. And there is a requirement that the property must have at least 4 dwelling units. Additionally, if you have any project with newly constructed residential units, there's a requirement for 20% of the residential units to be reserved for low and moderate income. And then finally, the last requirement is that the project must be a rehabilitation project, which the statute defines, or the rules define as a specific construction project or improvement or phase of a project or improvement undertaken by a business entity that includes the rehabilitation of a qualified property or transformative property. So obviously the property has to be located in the state of New Jersey, has to be income producing, and then it has to have one of the program is for properties that have been previously identified, and it has to have one of the following classifications or already identifications. So it has to be either individually or located within a historic district that is either in the National Register of Historic Places, the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, or in the Pinelands Commission. If it's a historic district, it must be contributing to the district. Then in addition to that, a property can also be an individual or part of a district that has been identified or registered for protection as a significant historic resource by a municipality in accordance with criteria for identification or registration that has been approved by the officer as suitable for substantially achieving the purpose of preserving and rehabilitating buildings. So what this basically means is that right now the second item is that has been identified by a certified local government in New Jersey. There's a number of local governments in New Jersey that they go through a process with the Historic Preservation Office to approve their processes and what the criteria that they use for identification. So if you have a property that has been identified by the certified local government, that meets this requirement. And again, just highlight that if it's in a district, whether it is for national New Jersey Pinelands or certified local government, it must be identified as contributing to the district. Next. Then for a transformative project or property, the bar is significantly higher. So in this case now, it's not just the district, the property has to be individually identified. So there is also a financial requirement, and it is the applicant must prove and the EDA must agree with, determine that the project and the property will have a project that will generate substantial increase in state revenues through the creation of increased business activity within the surrounding area. And then have the following designations. So it needs to be individually listed in the New Jersey Register of Historic Places. And also the property must have received a determination of eligibility from the keeper of the National Register of Historic Places. So this is not listed in the National Register, but a determination of eligibility has to have been received by this property, and it needs to have happened before this act was enacted. Then in addition to that, it has to have one or two additional designations that have to do with location. So it has to either be within 1/2 mile of the center point of a transit village as designated by NJEDA, and within a city of a first class, and city of a first class are Newark and Jersey City, or it must be located within a government restricted municipality. And those are Trenton, Atlantic City, and Patterson. Next. The other important thing with regards to the project definition is at the application point, the applicant must also pick what the selected rehabilitation period for the project will be. And the statute allows for two selected rehabilitation periods. It's either a 24-month period, and these are total length, maximum length for the project, and this is for construction. So this is when that clock starts at once the agreement is signed to when you get your TCO, or basically when the building goes or the project goes into service. So it's either 24 months for a single phase project, or a project can have up to 60 months, and that's for a project that is completed in distinct phases. And those distinct phases would have to be identified and outlined as part of the architectural plans and specifications for the project. Next. Alrighty, so now we'll talk about how much money, what's the award size. Next. And this will have to do with the type of project it is, which has to do with the type of project, property, and location you have. So for regular projects that have a qualified property in them, is a 40% up to a maximum of $4 million. If you have a qualified property, but this property happens to be within either a qualified incentive tract or a government restricted municipality, then the credit can be 45% up to a maximum of $8 million. And then if you have a transformative project, which is those that we just talked about that have a significantly higher bar, then that is 45 million up to a total of 50 million, maximum of 50 million. And if you remember before, 50 million is the annual cap. So that basically they can have as much money as we have. Next. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about the review of the application and how we'll do that. So the taxes will be allocated based on evaluation of the proposed project first. And first to the transformative project and then to other rehabilitation projects according to specific factors. So basically what that means is that we have the ability to potentially separate and have a separate application deadline for transformative projects on their own, and then one for regular projects. This would allow us to be able, number one, the transformative projects are significantly larger projects, and the competition to begin with is tricky, perhaps not apples to apples. And the other thing that allows us to do is the statute allows for quote unquote borrowing of funds from a subsequent year for a transformative project if there is a project that needs some money that we believe that is warranted and it meets all the requirements, and that and we believe that more money is needed from a subsequent year, we can borrow to certain amounts from subsequent years. So by separating transformative from regular projects, it allows us to better budget and figure out what the rounds will be. So what are the factors that we'll be looking at? So first, we'll be looking at the historic significance of the qualifier transformative project. So, how is it special? We'll be looking at potential threats to the structure, everything from physical condition and encroachment, as well as other things that could affect the longevity of the building to remain. We'll be looking at the project concept and the team, including stewardship of the building, if the building has been owned by the applicant for a particular amount of time. We'll be looking at site control, and do you own the property? Are you looking to buy it? Do you have a lease? Like, where are you, and are you ready to go, basically? And we're looking also at if the project is going to have a positive impact on the surrounding neighborhood. So we will be looking at all these factors, and they'll be set a minimum score that'll be used for you to be able to, that you have to meet to be able to move forward. Next slide. So these are some of the a little more specific information in each of those categories. So when we're talking about significance, we're talking about what's the type of designation: national, state, local, how much historic fabric remains, and integrity of the building, the significance, whether it's national, state, or local, if it's a rare example of its kind, if it's a national historic landmark, for example, like all those things we'll be looking when it comes to historic significance. With regards to threat to the resource, we'll be looking at issues that could, again, harm and mean that the building may not be there, or the property might not be there for much longer. Things such as, issues with building envelope, missing doors, windows, leaky roof, if there's structural condition issues in the building. If the building has been vacant and with no utilities for a long time, and as well as threat of encroachment. So, all the property around has been bought for a big development, and this is the last Hail Mary pass to be able to save the building. With regards to the project concept and the team, we'll be looking very closely at project approach, what you're saying you're doing, how you're doing, and how you're going to treat the resource, how compatible the use that you have is for the resource, and specifically we'll be looking at how what you're proposing will match the Secretary of the Interior standards. We're looking at project team experience. We'll look at the project schedule. Does it make sense, or are you saying you're going to finish in 24 months? What we know is really a 6-year project. We're looking at the construction cost to make sure that your costs are reasonable and it's not just a bunch of numbers that have been thrown in just to fill in an application. And as well as project permitting status, which kind of shows us where you are, how close you are and ready, what your project readiness is really. Site control, again, we're looking about whether you have secure site control or not. If you have not, a requirement will be that you must show that you have some kind of an agreement with the current owner, either to have right of entry, you have a letter of intent to buy or lease or something like that. And then impact on the surrounding neighborhood, we're talking about whether the project will address an unmet need in the neighborhood. You have community support, the project has the ability to attract small businesses or employers to the area. Like, what is the overall impact that this project is looking to have and could potentially have in the surrounding area and the community. Next, please. Alrighty, so then we have a couple of additional program information items. The first thing we wanted to highlight is that the program also allows for a co-applicant. And I think this is an important thing to highlight because, you know, when we talk about some historic buildings, there could be a situation where the building is either owned by a non-for-profit or it's owned by a for-profit, but it's being run by a non-for-profit. And there is an opportunity to have an agreement with the developer or the business entity, the applicant, to have a co-applicant. So what this would mean is that right now, under the definitions in the statute, not in the statute, in the rules, you could have a co-applicant that has to be a non-for-profit as 501c3. And that applicant have to have contributed either capital, property, services, whether it is, you know, anticipated resident, tenant, customer, tenants, or anything like that, and must have entered into a participation agreement with the developer or the business entity to participate in the project. Ultimately, what this translates to is that if you have, for example, a for-profit business that is entering into an agreement for a non-for-profit that is going to be managing the building, running their museum, running a store, running anything from the building, just as an example, and they have a participation agreement, what happens is at the end, as the co-applicant, when the credits come in, the credits could go into that co-applicant, which means that if you're selling the credits, then the credits can be sold without having to pay taxes, sales taxes on your tax credits to begin with. But again, I have to emphasize that it cannot be just a token non-for-profit that you bring in just for the purpose of this. There has to be a real involvement from this organization as part of the project. It's mentioned a couple of times before, but there's some prevailing wage requirements. So it's required that all project costs during construction are paid at prevailing wage. And then in addition to that, for building services, 10 years after project completion, you need to pay prevailing wage. With regards to this, it gets a little slightly different when it comes to a phase project. So when it's a phase project, that 10-year clock will start at the completion of the first phase that is completed for that project. For single phase projects at 20 months, 24 months, that the 10-year starts at the end of project completion, so at the end of the project. There's also prevailing, affirmative action requirements, and these will apply through the duration of the project, and shall apply also after the completion of the rehabilitation or 2 years after the first tax credit is issued. So you have to, for a single phase, you have to have prevailing wage for the entire duration. For a 5-year, for example, depending on when you get a certificate, the affirmative action requirements may end slightly before. As I mentioned just a second ago, you're able to transfer or sell your credits, but there are some kind of requirements for that. So you may sell or assign the credits in full or in part to another taxpayer in exchange for financial assistance. Those credits cannot be sold or transferred for less than 85% of the credit amount, which is basically 85 cents on the dollar, with one exception, which is for projects that have newly constructed residential units that have received federal low-income housing tax credits. And in that case, then the sale of taxes can be 75% of their value or 75 cents on the dollar. The other thing that is important to highlight is that the purchaser or assignee is not able to make any subsequent transfers, which means only one sale can happen for each credit. So if you buy credits, you cannot sell them to somebody else. Next. And then we also, and again, this is in all our programs and it is in the statute, once a transfer occurs, we do publish information to our website, and the information would include who is transferring the taxes, who's the person that they're being transferred to, the value of the credit, they may apply the credit, and consideration, meaning how much was paid for them. Next. Alrighty, so lastly, we'll want to talk a little bit about the program fees. And we divided them, they're basically into 3 different buckets. So we have projects that have rehabilitation costs up to 10 million. And that means, again, rehabilitation cost means eligible costs. So we have an application fee, an approval fee, agreement fee, certification, transfer, and modification. Application means what it sounds like. Is at the time of application, you have to submit a fee, it's $2,000. At approval, which means after if you are one of the top ranking projects, before we go to the board, you will be required to pay an approval fee. If for some reason the approval did not go through the board, this would be reimbursable. Then there is an agreement fee. So this agreement fee will happen before the agreement is signed. So after approval, before the agreement. And here there is a slight deviation, and this will apply to all the different buckets, which is that if you have a project for which you have applied for federal historic tax credits, and you already have your Part 2 application has been approved by the Historic Preservation Office, meaning somebody's already gone through and reviewed all your plans and specs and all your entire project for compliance with the Secretary of the Interior standards, we will accept that acceptance from the Historic Preservation Office. Therefore, the agreement fee will be lower for such a project. It will be half, $5,000 versus $10,000 without a prior federal approval. Then we have the certification fee. That's what happens right before you certify that you have completed the work you were supposed to be completed in the way you were supposed to do it. And at that point, you're ready to get your credit. So that certification fee will be $5,000 for this project size. And then transfer fee, meaning that if you're going to sell the credit to somebody, that's a fee that we have to pay at that time. The administrative, change modification fees, there's an administrative changes and that could be smaller changes that are simpler. And then major changes, for the most part, we expect that may even require to go to our board for approval, then the fee for that is significantly higher. Again, these are the same fees from the previous, just for projects that cost over $10 million. And again, you see that at the agreement fee, there is a difference between projects with prior federal credit program approval and no prior federal credit approval. And then lastly, next slide, we have transformative projects that are the really big projects. These other projects can get up to $50 million. So obviously the costs here are significantly higher. And again, the one deviation is on the agreement fee, which with prior approval versus no prior approval. Then we have this additional potential fees that allow for extensions. So we have a requirement, a fee for a 6-month extension. This is if you got your approval, but it's taking you longer than the required amount. You have a 1-year time frame by which you can get your approval and from approval to agreement. So if there was a reason that could not be completed, you were finishing something with some of your financial documentation that you haven't been able to obtain or something, you can then file for a 6-month extension. These are the costs based on the project type. And then if you at the end of your project, you get your TCO and you're done, and for some reason it's taking you more than a year to be able to finish paying all your subs or your contractor or whoever and close all your contracts for the project. If it's taking more than a year, you can apply for a 6-month extension at that time as well. And then finally, there is an agreement transfer, fee. So if you at some point, either right before you start or during the project, the business entity had to sell their interest in the project, basically sell the project to somebody else, there would be an agreement transfer fee for that. And I think that is it. So I push back to Patience.
Thanks, Idita. I appreciate it. At this point, we're going to ask everyone to start raising their hand if you do want to provide feedback or if you do have a clarifying question. And what I'll do is I'll call your name and unmute you, allow you to ask that question or provide that feedback, and then we'll move on to the next person. I'm looking through and don't see any raised hands right now. So please keep in mind, we are looking for feedback on our draft rules. We will provide clarifying statements if you need them, but likely not information on specific project eligibility. It's a little early for that, and we'll have a different forum for that. Typically, when we launch a project, we do have public webinars to talk through the programs and details, the application process, things like that. And most of the time, those are the avenues where folks can get project-specific questions answered or more project-specific questions answered. So again, if you're interested in providing feedback, raise your hand now, or if we go to the next slide, and we'll leave this slide up for the remainder. This is where you can provide your program-specific feedback in writing. And okay, hi, Jennifer Mazaway. I'm going to unmute you now. You should be, I think you might have to unmute yourself after I do.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Great. My question has to do with the caps, the annual caps, because it sounded like we had about $50 million per year, but a transformative.
Oh, we lost you, Jennifer.
We lost her.
Yep, it sounds like we lost Jennifer. Jennifer,
I think though her question has to do with, you know, if the cap is $50 million and you have a transformative project that can take the entire money, what happens? I'm going to go on a limb and say that's what the question is. And so the statute allows, and the rules also clearly include this information in them, but it allows for, with regards to a transformative project, for money to be borrowed up to a certain amount from a subsequent year. So the way we are looking to do these projects right now means that although a transformative project comes first, it's kind of funny because it comes first when you follow a calendar year, but truly it's really last because we go by fiscal year. So when we'll be reviewing the transformative projects, we know if there's any money remaining from the previous year, and we know that we have 50 million from a subsequent year. So we're able to, depending on what the project is, to be able to borrow from subsequent years. But the goal is that to try to keep at least 25 million for other projects. This doesn't have to happen, but ultimately the statute defines that you can borrow up to money from a subsequent year as long as you don't take more than 25 million. You don't leave a subsequent year with less than 25 million, if that answers the question.
Thanks, Aidita. Hopefully it did. We also have another iteration of this coming up on Monday the 20th, and that is at, I will tell you right now,
11:30.
At 11:30. Thanks, Aidita. So if you missed some parts of this and are looking to listen in again, we will be here Monday at 11:30. Looks like I do have a raised hand from Derek. Derek Danderand, if you could state your name and where you're calling from. I apologize, I forgot to ask that for the last time, but I'm going to unmute you now. If you could state your name, where you're coming from, you should be good to go.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Derek Danderan. I'm calling from White House Station, New Jersey. I'm the Director of Historic Preservation for Pursuant Design and Construction. I had a question about the 10-year prevailing wage requirement for building services. Is that something that is that included in the statute, or is this a proposed rule from NJEDA? And could you elaborate? And also, could you elaborate on what is defined as building services?
So it is included in the statute. It was actually included in the cleanup bill that was signed by the governor in, I believe, in July, early July of this year. It defines building service, so it's 10 years from project completion, and it defines building services. For the most part, anything that is very technical doesn't count, but general janitorial services will follow, under building services. I don't want to kind of paraphrase the definition, but it actually, if you go into either the statute or the rules, they define exactly what building services stand. But basically, for the what it's going to apply to is janitorial services.
All right, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Derek. We're moving through here. It seems like it takes folks a little bit of time to decide if they want to provide comments. We'll give it a few more minutes. Again, someone just put their comment in the chat. And oh, Elizabeth, thank you.
Liz.
Now I see what it is. So Derek, there's in the chat is a definition of building services. If there's no one else that would like to raise their hand, a reminder, Monday at 11:30, we'll be doing this again. These slides and this program will be available on the Historic Property Reinvestment Program site on the NJEDA website. We thank every one of you for joining, for providing your valuable feedback, and we wish you all a wonderful holiday season. Thank you.